Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here today, as usual. Welcome to another installment coming to you live from the Gay Street Studios, recording on Thursday. So I guess you'll be seeing this tomorrow. Um, my wife and child, our 14-year-old, just left this morning for Chicago. Kind of a big day for us as a family. My daughter. Is very serious about ballet, and I may have mentioned this before, but she got accepted into Ballet Chicago last summer for their summer intensive, and was unable to actually go there because of COVID. So she did it all online, and she was then invited to join the studio. Pardon me, and she we joined the studio, but she worked online here via Zoom live. I mean, really live, like synchronously um, from this studio right here, and they have just informed all the dancers um, that they are now encouraging people to come to Chicago to actually take live studio classes. So my wife and child went up, and we are lucky enough to have some good friends who have a co-op apartment in Hyde Park, which is right adjacent to the University of Chicago, um, and not too far of a mass transit ride to get to the ballet studio, which is sort of that downtown um, downtown Chicago. So they are going to be in Chicago for, at the very least, 4 more months. And after this term, I'll at least go up and visit, and I hope to be able to be teaching online this summer. And if I am given an online course, I'll be able to go up and teach from there. But anyway, so that's kind of where I am. But enough about me. Um, I want to introduce this great writer, great American artist, Zora Neale Hurston today. So no text necessary, nothing for you to have prepared for today. I just want to take you through kind of who Hurston was. Um, and I'm sure you all got my list of important names, important places, important ideas, and how to spell them. It's the equivalent of the blackboard or the equivalent of the whiteboard. So Hurston was born in 1891, right up the road in Notasulga, Alabama. So it's literally right up the road to Lochapoka, and just the town beyond Lochapoka. Lochapoka is about maybe 10 minutes from Auburn. And then Notasulga is probably maybe another 10 minutes past Lochapoka. So right up the road. She was born to John and Lucy Hurston, who were sharecroppers. And this is 1891. So she was actually born with almost a full decade to go in the 20th century. So she's roughly a peer of Ernest Hemingway. Actually, let me recalibrate that. She's roughly a peer of T.S. Eliot. Um, so we're somebody that's born right in the modern era. Um, uh, John Hurston, her dad, was a very severe Baptist minister, and she had 8 siblings. She was kind of one of the middle kids. I think she was if I'm remembering correctly, I think she was the 5th child of 8. And her mother was named Lucy, as I mentioned, and she taught Zora to read very early, before Zora even started school. So her mother, I think, if you had to name the most important very early influence on Hurston, it would be her mom. And she also encouraged her daughter's independence and her daughter's desire for education. Um, at one point in her life, she was being interviewed by an anthropologist named Melville Herskovitz. He's actually sort of a famous guy. And as she put it, she was, quote unquote, more white than Negro in her ancestry, quote unquote, more white than Negro in her ancestry. What this means is not exactly certain, and she probably had very little way of actually knowing that. But I think uh, um, suffice it to say, like many, many, many people who consider themselves quote unquote white, and like many, many, many people who considered themselves African American, or at the time one would have said quote unquote colored, um, uh, race, race was at this point in the South an admixture. Very, very, very lots of what used to be called miscegenation. I've always hated that word. I hate the way it sounds, and I hate what it implies. That is the violation of some kind of idea of purity, when actually, if you think it through scientifically, sociologically, race is a cultural race is a cultural construction. It's not a scientific construction. You don't have to actually think it through very far to get that. Um, but anyway, she I think it's safe to say she had some white ancestors somewhere along the way, probably in the usual and very rapey context that many African American families, particularly during this era, obviously during slavery, it probably was much more common, but even in this era, and she, her parents would have been born, if not in slavery, very close to after slavery, probably around the same time Dilsey was born in Sound and the Fury. Um, okay, well, the family moved very soon after Hurston's birth to a town called Eatonville, Florida. They moved in 1894, so Hurston would have been roughly 3.5 years old. Um, and Eatonville was important. Actually, it's a historically important town. It was one of the first, if not the first, one of the first incorporated African American towns in America. Now that's very insignificant. In other words, it was its own political entity, and therefore it could have its own police force, for example. So ways in which Black neighborhoods were ignored by white police forces could have been avoided by this town. I think that was what probably Jim Crow was what impelled Black towns to seek incorporation so they could actually have a functioning police force themselves. Well, John, the father, becomes a preacher, first at Zion Hope Baptist Church, and then later at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, which was the town's largest. And he becomes a civic leader in the town. In fact, he serves 3 terms as mayor. Well, Zora hung out with her father at Joe Clark's General Store. Let me just show you. Got a couple of. And there's Eatonville City Council members. This would have been 1907, so around 10 years after um, uh, John would have been mayor, and that is actually the jail behind them. And here's a shot of children playing in Eatonville in 1935. So this would have been a good bit later, 30 years later, shot by the famous recorder of Southern music, Black music, blues and gospel music for the Library of Congress. And the recordings, if you're interested in music, and in the blues and in ragtime and then in jazz, Alan Lomax was a hugely important figure, because without the Alan Lomax recordings, we would have had virtually no actual audio record of blues blues musicians playing in this period. So take a Google Alan Lomax and go to the Library of Congress, and you'll hear some beautiful recordings. Okay, well, at Joe's General Store, Zora listened to the menfolk debate town politics and gossip and tell stories on the porch. If you want to know what it was like to grow up in a town like Eatonville, you can kind of see the landscape in this wonderful photograph. Kind of bleak, it seems to me. And I think as I look at this photograph, I think that is Zora on the far right of the photograph. Lomax and Hurston work together, as I'll mention, and I think that's Hurston on the far right. It's great, just a great shot. One of my favorites. Okay. Yeah, check out Hurston's essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me. How It Feels to Be Colored Me. That came out in 1928. So she's writing that retrospectively. Now, an important event, I think you could argue, golly, the salient event in Hurston's life. Her mother dies in 1904. So Zora, if you do the math, is 13 when her mom dies. 13. So she's a young woman taught to read by her mother, encouraged to pursue her education by her mother, and her mother dies at 13. And this is where Hurston's personal history becomes pretty sketchy. We do know that she was sent away to a Baptist boarding school, sounds like fun, by her severe Baptist missionary preacher father in Jacksonville. And that was just for a short time. Evidently, her father stopped paying tuition not long after she was down there, and she was shipped back. But anyway, so she was sent down there after her father remarried a woman named Maddie less than 1 year after Lucy's death. And this evidently was scandalous, and it was kind of a subject of gossip and rumor that that her father had been having an affair with this woman, Maddie, before her mother actually died. And as far as I know, we do not know the circumstances of Lucy's death. Well, Zora was evidently passed from relative to relative, and she worked as a waitress. She worked as a housekeeper, what was then called a maid, a manicurist. And this is from her great autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. It was published in 1942, Dust Tracks on a Road, quote unquote. And this is Hurston writing about herself. It's a beautiful quote. It's one of those quotes you should copy down, and you want to copy down and put on your refrigerator for your friends and family to see when they come by. I had a way of life inside me, and I wanted it with a want that was twisting me. I had a way of life inside me, and I wanted it with a want that was twisting me. That twisting me, in other words, she had a desire in herself that her culture, the white supremacist larger culture of the South and of the nation, and also the severe misogynist evangelical background that was her family culture, her own desire to achieve flourished in conflict with, in contrast to the culture, the larger national culture, the regional culture. and the domestic culture that she was born into. And I think that kind of oppositional culture, I think we have many examples of this, particularly among women writers of this period, of, of any quote unquote racial background, but particularly from, I mean, imagine an African American woman born in 1891, that feels this sense of urgent, passionate ambition. Where does that go? And what does it do to you when you realize the world around you, the known world, is arrayed against that beautiful impulse? And how much has culture changed since then? How much has Southern culture changed since then? As we hear this news of the just this outrageous anti-voting legislation, essentially saying anti-civil rights legislation that's being put forward and passed in various states, most famously Georgia, right next door. Because Georgia has to be punished. Well, she's finally able Hurston is to enter high school in Baltimore at the Morgan Academy in 1917. Whoa. Mirror number 2, down the tubes. Notice there's one left up there. Gee, I wonder why my daughter wanted to go to Chicago. Caddy, Caddy, Mimi. I'll put up new mirrors. Come back. Han, come back. So Morgan, you have to remember 1917. So do the math there. She's entering high school in 1917. She's 26 years old. And she starts lying about her age at this point. So Morgan was the high school that was associated with this historically Black college called Morgan College. And she graduates very quickly from the high school curriculum in 1918. And she goes on to study at Howard University in DC. So she's in Baltimore and studies and gets accepted into Howard. Arguably the most important, the most famous historically Black college in the country. I'm teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates's great, what you call it, this autobiographical collection of essays that are kind of a memoir and a think pieces about what it means to be a young African American in today's America. It's just a fantastic book. I'm teaching it next semester. By the way, be very happy based on your work to have any of you in that class. It should be a great class. I taught a version of it last fall. Different number, but same course. or a different course, same class, you know. Um, but Ta-Nehisi Coates' great work Between the World and Me. He talks about Howard and how important Howard was to him. It's just a fantastic school. Um, so at Howard, she co-founds the Hilltop, the college newspaper. She publishes her first short story in Howard's literary club's journal called Stylus, and that's in 1921. And she gets noticed by a hugely important, hugely famous, particularly historically famous now, but very, very well known among African American intellectuals and white people seriously considering African American literature at the time. Alain Locke. He's a professor of philosophy. Um, with strong connections to the Harlem literary scene. Um, okay. He publishes, Alain Locke does, a book, a hugely important book called The New Negro in 1925. Or I shouldn't say he publishes, he edits this work. And it consists essentially of work of every single important literary artist of the time. Um, so that's a little bit later, but I'm going to talk about The New Negro, but a hugely important book, great cover too. 1925. Okay, well, Locke recommends her to Charles S. Johnson. It's not a great portrait. Recommends her to Charles S. Johnson, and he's the editor of Opportunity, which is a hugely important journal of, I guess you'd call it, African American culture, African American studies. So Locke and Johnson encourage Hurston to come to New York City in January of 1925. So we're still before the publication of The New Negro. Hurston is 34 years old, although most people think she's 24 years old because of the way she lies about her age. But it's important to know she's where you are now, where you guys are now, more or less. She's a 34-year-old woman, essentially, passing as a younger woman. I guess because she's self-conscious and because she thinks doors will be closed to her, emotional doors, professional doors, academic doors will be closed to her if people know that she is her age. She's 34. Well, she wins some awards at this banquet sponsored by the Opportunity magazine, and called the Opportunity Awards. She receives 2 awards. One is for fiction and one is for drama. The play she wins for was called Color Struck, and the story she wins for, short story, was called Spunk, S-P-U-N-K. And 2 of the judges there for the awards were Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright, modernist American playwright, and the melodrama queen Fannie Hurst. Hearst hires Hurston as her secretary, even though Hurston had no particular clerical skills. And she becomes a kind of exotic for hire. Sort of embarrassing that Hearst put Hurston through this, but there it is. She would she'd have to wear a turban and tell people she was an African princess. People that would come over for Hearst's literary / cocktail parties. This is, and I think it was considered an opportunity at the time. Speaking of opportunity, it was an opportunity for Hurston, as condescending an opportunity as we would see it as from our point of view. I hope you don't mind me I don't mean to sound opinionated at all, but just trying to frame it for you. I think the way we would see it, we as progressives living in 2021 would see this kind of quote unquote opportunity. It's a problematic opportunity. Well, Spunk, the short story, is published in Opportunity early in 1925, and then, importantly, it's reprinted in the New Negro in 1925. Later in 1925. Well, Hurston meets Annie Meyer, a trustee of Barnard College, and Barnard College what was Columbia University's affiliated school for women. So Columbia would not have accepted women at this time in history of education or in American history. But so women wanting to be associated with Columbia would have gone to Barnard. So an excellent school. Um, uh, she impresses this trustee and is given a scholarship, a full scholarship to Barnard, and enrolls in 1925. Hurston, I mean, this in and of itself is worthy of historical mention. She should be famous just for this. She's the only student of color enrolled in Barnard in 1925. Uh, Amazing. The only African American student at Barnard. Well, at Barnard, hugely important moment for Hurston. She discovers anthropology. Let me get a drink real quick, y'all. Excuse me. Um, in the form of the very famous anthropologist Franz Boas, who actually founded the anthropology department at Columbia. So he's like, he's like the first anthropologist in America. Um, uh, Hurston loved Boas. She called him, quote unquote, this is a quote from Hurston, the King of Kings, the King of Kings. I had a couple of people, one in particular in graduate school that I thought of my dissertation director, pardon me, in the same way, so I can relate to this. Boas was interested in African history, pardon me, African cultures, and his own work emphasized the importance of African cultures in world civilization and the stature of Southern Black culture as the inheritor of Africa in the problematic American context. So he really gives Hurston not only a sense of the importance of Africa historically in global civilization, he also gives her a sense that African American culture in the South, in particular, in the South, but in the North as well, is part of the significant historical continuum that he has discovered for white academia. So he's really a very important figure. Well, in this, so she moves into this Harlem apartment house. It's a famous place. I'm going to use a controversial expression, but Hurston herself, so this does not come from anywhere but Hurston herself and her friends famously dubbed the place where they all lived in this time in this period of time Niggerati Manor. I'm smiling at the wry irony of the term. So niggerati, a play on literati. We use that word glitterati, coming from literati. Well, Hurston and her friends took it in another direction. And this was at 267 West 130th Street, which would have been, that's 16 blocks up into Harlem. So Columbia is right at the. You guys know who've been in New York. So I don't mean to be like Uncle Wisdom, Uncle History here, but if you've been in New York, Columbia is at 120th Street, so that's at the very top of Central Park, and everything past 120 120th Street is Harlem. So 136 would have been well in, 16 blocks up. But Harlem was, as you know from our study of jazz, right? Harlem is just rocking at this particular period. It's going to get even better. Checking time here. Okay. Um, going to get even better very soon. But this is 1926. Nigarati Manor is owned by a famous woman named Iolanthe Sidney, who gives rooms rent free to artists. She's independently wealthy. She herself is a different story. If you're interested in the history of Harlem, you have to study with our great teachers, Dr. Julia Charles, as well as Dr. Ernest Gibson, Dr. Charles, Dr. Gibson, particularly interested in the history of Harlem as well. Just very important people to study with here. And also study with Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Jenna Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is more interested in the Caribbean. It's where she hails from, but is also very well schooled in the American and African American history, the history of people of color in this country as well. So wow, I got to tell you, if you're interested in African American literature and culture, you're at a great school because these three people are tremendously accomplished people. I mean, they run circles around me. So do just, you don't have to mention it to them, but just my highest recommendation: you have to study with these. They're also just lovely people. As people, I consider all of them friends. I was involved with the hiring of all of them, and just very proud that I played a small part in bringing them here. So it's a little McKelly recommendation moment there. So sorry. Yeah, so Iolanthe Sidney gives out rooms rent free to artists, and Nigarati Manor becomes one of the primary headquarters of what would become the avant-garde of the Harlem Renaissance. And Hurston is in on the ground floor. She lives with, check this out, she lives with Langston Hughes, the great poet who wrote the mythic archetypal American and African American poem, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." I'm sure some of you have studied that great poem and Hughes's other poetry. She lives with Hughes, probably gay. Then she lives with the novelist Wallace Thurman, who wrote the great book, The Blacker the Berry. And she also lives with Bruce Nugent, the painter, a gay painter, as well as a kind of a part-time novelist. And she helps with the three of them edit this great magazine called Fire. And I thought of why it's called Fire, and I finally got it. I mean, it's not out there. I'm just speculating, but it's the word you're not supposed to yell in a crowded theater. It's against the rules to yell, because it means that people have to act, and that action is dangerous, right? So they're clearly speaking to they're speaking as young people. And now remember, Hurston is a good bit older than these other her peers here, a decade plus older, or a decade anyway. And this is one of the first shots across the bow, not just of white supremacist culture, but white artists, white literary artists, and white painters, white dramatic artists, and also across the bow of the older and more conservative African American intelligentsia of the time. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, right? It's a short-lived journal, one issue, but they got it out and it looks great. And so that cover there is a cover by Bruce Nugent, so you can see the kind of work he does. I'll show you some more, uh, 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 some more in a minute. This is Bruce Nugent. This is what he looked like. Fantastic portrait of Nugent, and I show you a couple of there his work. So he does this highly graphic work, which you can see on the left. That's why he's so great at designing book and magazine colors. He was commissioned to design many, and this is his own art on the right. Really nice. Really nicely put. I should say nicely expressed. I'd be very interested in people wanting to look at Nugent's work in a paper, if you like, and connections to Hurston's work would be great as well. But just in and of itself, if you're interested in thinking analytically and interpretively about Nugent's work, I'd be really interested in reading a paper on that. It'd be a great way to go. Okay. And this is Langston Hughes. This is a little bit later. Hughes is older here, but it's Harlem. I don't know which way he's looking, uptown or downtown. I think he's looking downtown, but I'm not sure. But Stoop in Harlem. And this is Wallace Thurman. A little bit of, sorry, that digital image is a little fuzzed out. I thought it was a good portrait of him. You get a sense for what he really looked like here. Sorry, but I blew it up a little too big. Okay, now this is W.B. Du Bois. So these, checking on time here. Excuse me. These young African-American artists, these young artists of color, they would have thought of themselves as colored artists, opposed some of the notions of Black representation, African-American representation, promulgated by this man, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his journal, Crisis, as well as Charles Johnson and Locke in their journey. In Johnson's work, Opportunity. Sorry, getting a little ahead of myself here. So this is Du Bois. Let me back up because I don't want you to read this just yet. So there's Crisis, which is Du Bois's organ. Right, he's the boss of Crisis, and he's a hugely significant cultural critic writing at this time. His influence is still felt very deeply, and the ideas proposed by Du Bois are still part of the ongoing issues. African-American literary scholars, African-American artists of every stripe, musicians, poets, fiction writers, dramatists, painters, dancers, etc., are still interested in pursuing. He's still right at the center of African-Americans, of the evolving African-American idea of itself as a cultural entity, a hugely potent cultural entity, cultural phenomenon. Maybe that's a better word. So this is Crisis, and that cover is Bruce Nugent as well. Good. Okay, so Du Bois. Du Bois called for a kind of a represent the race kind of imperative for African-American artists of various stripes. In other words, for Du Bois, it was the job of what he called, quote unquote, the talented tenth, the quote unquote talented tenth, to exemplify the positive, what he saw as the positive attributes of Black people as role models and examples. So it was the job of the African-American artist of every stripe to present African-American culture and white supremacist culture, white culture at large, with positive images of Black people. The artists themselves were supposed to be role models, and their art was to be a kind of vehicle for the presentation of images of African American culture that he would have classified. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can. That he would have classified as quote unquote positive, right? Let's as an example here. This is from Du Bois' great essay, 1928. You can't see the date. I'm sorry. Called "The Criteria of Negro Art." It's a famous paragraph. You'll see this reprinted in many different places. Check this out. This is Du Bois, 1928, 3 years after the New Negro, right as the Harlem Renaissance is gaining. Right as the Harlem Renaissance is gaining momentum, and right as exactly the artists that we were talking about, the jazz artists that we were talking about, are beginning to create Harlem as the spot to be, not just for African American people interested in Black music, but people generally interested in American culture and interested in African American culture as it evolves. Now, often that interest on the part of white people, particularly upper middle class and affluent class white people, that was a very condescending kind of interest in some ways. I think it needs to be said. In other ways, it's simply the most progressive individuals in a supremacist, racist culture encountering that subaltern culture in honest ways. Now that's at its best, right? But regardless, wow, you have all that jazz beginning to happen right after, right in the area of 1925, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, Harlem bursting with literary and dramatic and terpsichoric art, fancy word for dance, because of all the clubs that are just blossoming there, and this tremendous efflorescence of African American art. And Du Bois is one of the, what should we say, one of the cultural arbiters of this movement. Alain Locke is another of the cultural arbiters of this movement. Charles Johnson, another exponent of this artistic efflorescence. But there's a bit of a tension, between young African American people that are going nuts for jazz and these older, more conservative cultural figures. And so here's Du Bois: all art is propaganda, and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. So I say parenthetically here, I guess he had in mind, the wailing of writers, like Zora Neale Hurston, and the wailing of other figures, like Hurston's friends, staying at Iolanthe Sidney's place, right? Despite the wailing of the purists, I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda. Well, Hurston and her friends are asserting a different a different proposition. And that proposition is, I'm being very reductive here, but you'll see in Eyes Are Watching God, that proposition is this, that Black art and Black culture is something to be proud of in its most demonic forms, in its most elemental forms, in its most quotidian daily forms, even daily forms that you find in the deepest part of the Deep South that aren't going to look so sophisticated to upper middle class and affluent class white people on Manhattan, and the intellectual leaders from the Black community that inhabit Harlem and Washington, D.C. You see? So Hurston's earliest voices, see, there's Franz Boas, right? And there's Hurston's anthropological voice. African America is beautiful in all of its forms, and these forms should be celebrated. Not these forms should not be something that we're trying to cover up, right? You can see the same tensions at work in The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, right? Same tensions at work in Jimmy Baldwin's work, coming a little bit later in the century. But the same issues are at play here. Richard Wright's work, in fact, Richard Wright weighs in very negatively against uh, against Hurston and her early published work. It must have hurt her to some degree to hear her work critiqued by another another African American writer, and if I may say so, I believe there's a lot of misogyny being applied by these male African American cultural critics and male African American writers toward Hurston. Um, so it's a really exciting moment here. I think Hurston took a lot of hits, though, that she did not deserve. I just love Hurston's work. I defend her to the death. Um, okay, so uh, and in that early Fire magazine, in that early journal Fire, um, Hurston's contribution was a short story called Sweat, Sweat, Sweat. Um, be really interested in, if you're interested in looking at these early stories, they're eminently available. And, we don't have time to read them, but if you're interested in, looking, for example, at the relationship between these early stories and the way Hurston goes in Eyes Are Watching God, right? It'd be a really cool paper to write. That's been done, but don't worry about it that it's been done. What I love is hearing your own voice. Don't worry about whether you're examining something that some PhD student, at Brown has already examined, 40 years ago. I mean, don't worry about that. What you need to find, the joy you need to find right now, y'all, is in your own voice, your own cultural voice, your own scholarly voice, your own ideas as they've been shaped. And it's perfectly great to read, if you're interested in reaching out and reading what other people have to say, that's fantastic. But I don't want you to feel under the gun to do that. I'm not so interested in quote unquote researched work. I'm not interested in reading a billion citations from a billion other scholars. What I'm interested in, your ideas, the evolution of your own scholarly voice, damn it. That's the most important thing for you guys right now. In other words, the development of your own soul as thinkers, your own soul as writers. You all write so beautifully. It's been such a great pleasure to read your discussions, your discussion assignments. Just really great stuff. It's great. Not everybody has been on. I'm not. This is a big compliment for everybody, but some of you put a little less of effort into things. Some of you have missed the couple. but generally speaking, just fantastic work. Okay, well, Hurston, marriage number one, marries her Howard University boyfriend in May of 1927. His name is Herbert Sheen. He's a jazz musician, surprise, surprise. Um, she is 36 years old, and he thinks that she's, 26. Um, and they stayed there. They get divorced 3.5 years later. It's not clear exactly when the marriage falls apart in that time period, but falls apart before the actual divorce. Oftentimes, it was just too much trouble to get divorced after marriages fell apart. And the only times you'd get divorced would be when you needed to marry somebody else. Not so true. Not so true these days. Although sometimes it is. As some of you probably know. Okay, well, in the fall of 1927, so 2 years after she's featured in the New Negro and joins Columbia, she meets Mrs. Osgood Mason, who's a patron of the arts, and she's interested in quote unquote Negro primitivism, quote unquote Negro primitivism, hugely condescending. Hugely smug, hugely problematic. But that's the way people referred to these arts at this particular time. And it would have been a phrase that Hurston was very familiar with as an anthropologist, right? Okay, well, for the next 3 years, between 27 and 30, Hurston travels to the South to collect Black folk artifacts. And she's under the direction of Franz Boas while she's doing this. Well, the stock market crashes, right? And she works in the Federal Theater Project in New York and the Federal Writers Project in Florida. These are both Roosevelt era programs. They're part of the New Deal, the quote unquote. When people talk about the Green New Deal, in other words, what's the next New Deal going to be? Because we're in need of one now. What's its shape going to be? The original New Deal, I don't have time to go into it at length, but would have been the nation's saving program that the Roosevelt administration put into practice. This is why the guy was elected 4 times, because he was so popular and the program was so meaningful to so many Americans. That he was a hugely important figure for that reason. And then she works with Alan Lomax, whom I've already mentioned. Lomax, he was making his first important field recordings of African American folk music for the Library of Congress in 1935, and that's what those early shots are from. Here's another one. Hurston, isn't that a great shot? Wow, you really get a sense for her personality there, don't you? Okay, well, she publishes her first novel, Jonah's Gourd Vine, in 1934. Pardon me. And it's critically very well received. It doesn't sell, doesn't make any money, but critics liked it. And then she publishes Of Mules and Men, and here's a shot of it right now. Okay, now again, the only African-American woman, the only woman of color in Barnard, the first history of folklore by an African-American author, not just by an African-American woman, but by this is the first work of Black folklore published by an African-American author. Hugely important cultural act. And for this alone, she deserves to be remembered today. This is a wonderful book. Again, very interested in anybody that would like to take another of Hurston's work and compare it to Eyes Are Watching God. that would be a really a fun paper to write. Okay, in both Jonas Gordvine, the fiction, and Of Mules and Men, the sociology, there's ample evidence of her interest in and skill at rendering the living particular details, linguistic and social, of Southern Black culture. Linguistic and social cultural details of Southern Black culture. So she wins a Guggenheim based on this work to study voodoo practices in the Caribbean in 1936. There's a Hurston in Eatonville in 1935, right? So the Guggenheim, she records her essay on the experience in an essay. She records her experience in an essay called "Tell My Horse," in 1938. It's a great essay. But evidently, her real reason for wanting to leave New York City was not an interest in researching voodoo, but in escaping from a relationship with a man she refers to as PMP. His real name was Percy Punter, PMP, Percy Punter. She refers to him as PMP in Dust Tracks. And he was 25, right? At the time of their relationship, she was 40. He was 25, she's 40. As she put it, and these are Hurston's words, she needed, quote unquote, to fight myself free from my obsession. She needed to fight myself free from my obsession. Some of you might understand that perspective on a relationship. Incidentally, later, a guy named Robert Hemingway, Hemen, Hemingway, was writing her biography, and he looks this guy up, and the guy never knew what happened. One day, he says her bags were packed and she was gone. He was a grad student at Columbia. And I'm haunted by that phrase. She wanted something for herself. She wanted a life for herself with a want. I'm paraphrasing, sadly. My old bald white dude's memory doesn't even last 20 minutes. But she wanted something for herself with a want that was twisting her. I'm haunted by that phrase, with a want that was twisting me. One day her bags were packed and she was gone. This is this is really why academics want Guggenheims. I'm joking. But there's always this personal dimension. Why do you really want to go to Haiti to study? Okay, so she's in Haiti in the fall of 1936, a period of 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, she writes, "Their eyes are watching God." I mean, that's just an act of genius as far as I'm concerned. It's a book in which she intended to, and this is Hurston, I'm quoting Hurston, to embalm all the tenderness of my passion for him, referring to Punter, PMP, to embalm all the tenderness of my passion for him. So the tea cake character was inspired by Punter. Okay, so when you're reading about tea cake, it's about Punter, which is really interesting if you think about tea cake and his role in the story and how his author treats him. Well, Eyes Are Watching God is published in 1937. I'm going to check time here. So The members, so the publication is 1937, the members of a growing, very heavily politicized post-Harlem Renaissance avant-garde, people like Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son in 1940, pardon me, the novel was viewed, Eyes Are Watching God, was viewed as being counter-revolutionary, right? Famously, Richard Wright was a, a a Marxist revolutionary. And he applied Marxist theories to the position of African Americans in white supremacist culture. Native Son is in part an examination of a critical examination of that leftist the leftist treatment of people of color and the political position of people of color. So anyway, it was viewed as counter-revolutionary and also just superficial. Wright reviewed the novel for this famous leftist journal called New Masses, and he accuses Hurston of practicing minstrelsy, of desiring more than anything else to make white people laugh at Black people. That's how he sees the book. Wow, it just strikes me as a very, voicing an opinion here, but it strikes me as a very blindered view. Again, a misogynist view, a very limited view of the novel. Anyway, he says, and this is quoting Richard Wright, the novel contained, quote, no theme, no message, no thought, unquote. The novel contained no theme, no message, no thought. Wow, what a hugely, I gotta shut up. And he felt that the novel pandered to white interests through what he called its quote unquote facile sensuality. Its facile sensuality. Not saying anything. I have to say something. What it seems to me that he really can't deal with is this very, very frank depictions of the experience and the beauty of African American female sexuality. He cannot encounter it. He's got to label it. He's got to classify it, and he's got to denigrate it. Okay, well, she has another failed relationship. She publishes a work called Moses, Man of the Mountain, and it's just horrible. I could not make it through it. It's a blackface retelling of Exodus. And it's very unsuccessful as a work of art. Characters are stereotypes. The language is stereotypical. She also makes some other mistakes. They're interesting mistakes. I'd be very interested in reading papers on this period of Hurston's life. Wrote a series of articles, letters to the editor, voicing what we would perceive from our point of view as very reactionary ideas about the place of Black people in American society that caused her to be seen as a traitor to Black people and the growing cause of civil rights. Now, I think this is an unfair assessment. But listen to some of the quotes, okay? Quote, I think that it should be pointed out that what is known as Negro dialect in the South is no such thing. White Southerners did not get their speech patterns from Negroes. The Africans coming to America got it from them. Okay. Another quote. She's talking about the landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that makes segregated school systems illegal. So this is Thurgood Marshall, right? He's the kind of the lead attorney in this case. He, of course, goes on to be the first African-American Supreme Court justice, one of the most important figures in the history of African-American history, in the history of American history, in American history, I should say. She declares that that landmark decision was, this is Hurston, quote unquote, insulting. She declares herself a segregationist and was applauded for this position by white Southern conservatives. So she's perceived by kind of the African-American avant-garde, even kind of the African-American, sort of average Black people involved in the civil rights movement. She's viewed as the enemy. She's viewed as kind of making segregationist culture, continuing to make it possible. Just very, very unfortunate. Alice Walker, she's the woman that wrote The Color Purple. She writes of one of Hurston's later works. It was reactionary. This is Alice Walker talking about her hero, Zora Neale Hurston. I'll talk about that in a second. Reactionary, static, shockingly misguided, and timid. That's Alice Walker talking about Hurston. Mary Helen Washington, another hugely important writer and critic, she calls this later work vacuous as a soap opera, vacuous as a soap opera. And additionally, in September of 1948, Hurston's accused by the Children's Society of sexually molesting an emotionally disturbed 10-year-old boy. Hurston is arrested, indicted. The charges were dismissed as fabrication. The case was thrown out of court. But as you know, that kind of case, even being brought against you, will ruin your professional life and will ruin your personal life. And this is exactly what happened. She leaves New York City. She returns to Florida. She works as a cook. She works as this is the woman that wrote The Eyes Are Watching God, the woman that wrote the very first book of cultural anthropology written by an African American, a woman who was the only African American woman at Barnard when she was there. This woman returns to Florida, works as a cook and a maid. She dies in a welfare home in St. Lucie County in Fort Pierce, Florida. She's buried in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery in Fort Pierce. And how is it possible that we're still reading her? Well, Alice Walker, again, writer of The Color Purple, writes an essay for Ms. Magazine. Ms. Magazine is Gloria Steinem's kind of proto-feminist, second wave feminist magazine, a hugely important magazine for the women's movement. Ms. Magazine. Walker's essay is called In Search of Zora Neale Hurston. And she finds the grave, and she has a tombstone made that says Zora Neale Hurston. Okay, there's Hurston in 1935 in Eatonville. And she has a proper grave made on the site. And as you can see, the tombstone says Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South, novelist, folklorist, anthropologist, 1901 to 1960. Now, that 1901 date is not accurate, right, as we've discovered. Nevertheless, this is the way Hurston ends up. She needs to be rediscovered in 1975. Their Eyes Are Watching God has sold literally tens of millions of copies in its contemporary in the last 35 years, multiple million copies. Movie rights were purchased by Oprah Winfrey. The film was made. I found the film very disappointing. Be that as it may. And you can also read in 2001 a collection of folk tales. Folk tales was a collection of folk tales that Hurston herself collected in the 20s was published. So that's relatively recent. And it's called Every Tongue Got to Confess. Every Tongue Got to Confess. And these are folk tales collected by Hurston. And it was discovered in the Smithsonian archives in 2001. So, wow, an American story. An American story, if there ever was one. And here is Hurston. I love this photograph.